طيب احنا كنا فاتت اتكلمنا عن ان احنا عملنا زي panoramic view for the Bible, and we started with some basic information about the Bible, and then we moved to the Old Testament. So let's try to just revise it quickly, and then we can continue our topic. Like mentioned last time, that we can divide the Bible and church history, which we were going to talk about as part of the New Testament as well, into 16 or maybe 17 eras or 17 stations, okay? So the Old Testament has 8 of them, and then one between both testaments, and then another 8 in the New Testament and church history. So every era or every station, we said that it has specific characteristics with regard to the relationship between the characters and God. It also has some books that talks about this era. So for example, let's go quickly. So we have the first station is called the primitive history, which is everything before the covenant with Abraham. So this is the first stage where God is telling us how he created the world, how his initial plan was for the world, and so on. And of course, the book that talks about this is Genesis. And we hear about stories like the Tower of Babel, like the flood, all this in the primitive history. And then the next step in God's plan was the patriarchal history, or when God chose one person, the patriarch, and it was Abraham, the first one, and he made a covenant with this person. So he made a relationship with one person, and the person represents his family. He was the priest, he was the teacher, and he was the leader of the family. And in this era we have Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and also Job was one of the people in this era. And then we move to Moses in Exodus. That's when God moved from dealing with one person to dealing with a nation. And then he sent his commandments, he sent the law, he sent also one of the major feature is the place where God reside among his people, which was the tabernacle. And then we spoke about the next phase is the judges, or Joshua and the judges, and this is the stage where the Israelites had a leader, and he wasn't a centralized leader, he wasn't a king, but a localized leader that will solve the problem for the kingdom of Israel for some time, and then he go back to be part of the people. The next station was the United Kingdom that has 3 kings. We remember Saul, David, and Solomon. And then later on it was divided into 2 kingdoms, one in the north, which is Israel, and one in the south, which is Judah. And in the divided kingdom, for the first time, the political leader is not the spiritual leader. So now we have 2 characters that sometimes are at odds of each other, the king and the prophet. When the king is good, then he listens to God's message through the prophet. But when he's bad, then there is some sort of a conflict, like what happened between Elijah and Ahab. So he was a bad king, and then the prophet has to fix what he's doing. And for the kingdom of Israel, all the kings were bad. For the kingdom of Judah, some of them were good. And this era ends in the exile. The exile, we said that kingdoms from the world around them, Babylon for Judah and Assyria for Israel, came and took the people and moved them elsewhere. So that was the exile. They stayed in the exile for some time, and then they returned back on also 3 waves. They went away in 3 waves and returned back in 3 waves, and started to rebuild what has been destructed. So it's the era of reformation, spiritually and physically. And that's when they returned from the exile. And then we said between the 2 testaments, we have some of the books that we call the second canonical books or deuterocanonical books, like the Maccabees and Wisdom of Sirach and other books. Okay, so this was the Old Testament quickly. So let's move to the New Testament. So the New Testament, of course, starts with the coming of the Savior. So that was the peak of God's plan for our salvation. So we have been moving through the Old Testament, how God has prepared the humankind, starting from the original sin. He had prepared the humankind for the Savior that will come and fix everything that has been destructed through the original sin. So the New Testament starts with the coming of the Savior, or Jesus Christ. And of course we have in the books that talks about this era is the four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And this era is around 30 years. It starts from 4 BC to 30 AD. This is the 30 years or 33 years that Jesus Christ lived on earth. And in terms of what was happening in the world, at this time, the Roman Empire was the major power of the world. And this also helped. So God, when He chose the timing, that was the right timing that helped Christianity later on to can be preached along the world, because it was only one empire in the center of the world. And everything happened in Canaan, and some of the things happened in Egypt. That's when Jesus went, when He was escaping from Herod. So in this era, of course, happened the Nativity, baptism, all the parables and miracles of Jesus Christ, and that's what happened along the life of Jesus. So that's all covered by and of course at the end was the crucifixion, the resurrection, and the ascension. So that's the first station in the New Testament. This was followed by another station, which is the early church. So once Jesus was ascended to heaven, He sent the Holy Spirit, which happened on the Pentecost, and that's is the day when the church was born. So the early church is the era of time when the apostles were the active leaders of the church. So it starts directly after the ascension of Jesus Christ, so around 30 AD, until the death of the last of the apostles, who is St. John, at around 100 AD. So it's like an era of 70 years. In this 70 years, the apostles were the active leaders of the church. The disciples and the apostles were the active leaders of the church. And we read about this in Acts, in Paul's letters, and other letters like James, Peter, John, and Jude, of course. At this time also, the Roman Empire was still in control. It was very strong and was controlled by one emperor who controlled all the Roman Empire, which, like we said, make it easier for Christianity to move around the world, because the Romans had some kind of system that allowed people to move freely from one province or one country to another. So that they provided security, they provided protection for everyone to move from one place to another. That's why we read in the Bible that Jews from everywhere can come to Jerusalem, and they can celebrate the feasts in Jerusalem safely. That didn't happen before that. But during the Roman Empire, they pledged to protect everyone inside their empire. So for the Romans, when Christianity started, they just thought that it's another part of Judaism, so they didn't care much about Christianity. But at some point, they realized that it's not part of Judaism, and that the Jews themselves are persecuting Christians, and they reject what they are saying. So the Romans started to persecute Christians, and that started by Nero, who killed St. Peter and St. Paul. So that was the first persecution for Christianity. That's when the Roman Empire realized that this is a new religion. And for the Romans, they have some like a list of religions that can be practiced in the empire, so that they can maintain political stability. So not any religion can be practiced. They have a universal religion, which is the Roman religion, and they have some local religions, including Judaism and some of the local religions around the world. But Christianity wasn't like that. It wasn't a local religion, it was a universal religion, and they felt that this might be dangerous for them politically. And so the next era that we read about we moved now from the Bible to the church history. You know, we always say that the church history or the church is a continuation to the book of Acts. So that's what we are seeing here as well. So after the early church started the era of persecution of the church. So this is not in the Bible, but we read about it in the books of the apostolic fathers, like the Didache, the apostolic father writings, and other fathers' writings. So this is like the first era of persecution. At this time, the leaders of the church are called the apostolic fathers. Who are the apostolic fathers? The apostolic fathers are the direct disciples of the apostles. So those are people who have dealt with the apostles face to face. So they have dealt with the apostles, and they are the direct disciples of the apostles. Like Saint Polycarp, like Saint who else? Qudis Polycarpus and Clement of Rome, one of them as well. So these are the apostolic fathers. And also, most of them were martyred because this was the era of persecution. So you'll see here that Clement of Rome, Saint Irenaeus afterwards, and then another generation of fathers came after that. So this was the persecution of the church. Among the people that also appeared at this time are the early theologians or the early fathers, like Origen, like Hippolytus of Rome, and like Saint Cyprian. These are the early church fathers. They started in the time of persecution, and they were the first to write theological books and to discuss the faith in details. And that was still in the era of persecution. The era of persecutions extended until the year 313. At this time, something very significant happened, which is the Edict of Milan. At that time came an emperor called Constantine, and he wasn't yet a Christian emperor, but he pledged to be tolerant to the empire. So he issued, once he was victorious and he controlled the empire, he issued something called the Edict of Milan. The Edict of Milan is like, it permitted all the people to practice their religion freely all over the empire. So everyone can do whatever he liked. He wasn't Christian back then, but he permitted Christianity to exist along with other religions. So for the first time, Christianity became a religion that can be practiced freely in the empire, and Christians started to live freely and practice their religions freely. And later on, Emperor Constantine also became Christian, and which helped the church a bit more. So at this time, that's the era that we called the Economical Councils era. So this era, the church was now free from persecution. They are no longer trying to hide or trying to escape from persecution. So they started to look into internal affairs. So they started to look into the teachings of the people in the church and what sort of dogma or what sort of teaching they are doing. And then happened the economical council. So whenever, like we know that some people came with wrong teachings, like Arius, like Nestorius, like Otaki later on, and then they started to do something that they learned from the Bible, which is the council. So whenever the church is faced with a problem, they go back to Acts in the year 50, when the church was faced with a problem. They decided to solve it in the form of a council. So like they gather all the bishops from the Christian world, and they sit together and discuss the matter, and whatever they reached, they felt that God is the one who guided them to this decision. And that happened in Nicaea, it happened in Constantinople later on, and in Ephesus. And this era is very important because at this era, the creed was formulated into a written form. So before that, like we said, the apostolic fathers were taught by the apostles. They know the creed, they know the dogma, but they haven't written it into a written form. So the church needed at this time to formulate this creed or these beliefs into a written form. And that's when the church fathers like Saint Athanasius, like Saint Cyril of Alexandria, Saint Gregory the theologian, and Saint Basil, Saint John Chrysostom, Saint Jerome, Saint Augustine. All these saints came in this time, which is the 4th and 5th century, and they formulated the faith into a written form. Okay, so books from this era is of course the Nicene Creed. That's one of the very famous writing of this era, and all the writings of the Father, especially theological writing that has been written by all these fathers that we just mentioned. Okay. At this time, another development happened at the age of Theodosius, the emperor. He declared Christianity the official religion of the empire. So you see how it went through. So first Christianity was persecuted, then Emperor Constantine started to tolerate all the religions, and then Emperor Theodosius approved Christianity or embraced Christianity as the religion of the empire. At the same time, came something very important, which is the rise of monasticism. So at this time that we are talking about, the golden age of church fathers, where they wrote about the creed, also happened that the first monks and the first monastic orders appeared in Egypt first, and then all around the world. So at the year also 300 and 400, Saint Anthony the Great started to establish monasticism. And later on, Saint Anthony started as small groups, and then Saint Macarius started with slightly larger group, where one priest or one teacher is followed by a group of people. And then Saint Pachomius and later on Saint Chinute started the system of the monastery, where there is one abbot and he's surrounded by a monastery, and later on group of monasteries as well. So this system started in Egypt, and then it moved on to all over the world. And we have stories of fathers like Rufinus, like Saint Jerome, like many of these fathers, Western fathers, who came to Egypt just to learn the system of the monasteries and move it and transfer it back to their countries. And the writings that we know about at this time is, number one, also the monastic rules. So Saint Chinute and Saint Pachomius put some rules for their followers in the monasteries to know how to be a good monk, and what to do and what to read and stuff like that, rules. And also the sayings of the Desert Fathers. So we have many books. One of them is the famous one, the Sayings of the Desert Father, but plus that, we have other books that have quotes and sayings of the Desert Fathers that people were reading to learn more about these figures of faith. Okay, so that's called the Economical Councils era. That was followed by the era that we call the post-Chalcedon era. So the previous era ended by the first split in the church, which happened in the year 451, around the Council of Chalcedon. The church was split into two groups: people who approved the council and others who rejected the council. Of course, the Coptic Church was among the group that rejected the council. So after that, the Christianity became split as two bodies of Christians: the East on one side, and then the West on another side. And from this era, I think we talked about it maybe once before, came many of the saints that we know as well, like Saint Dioscorus, of course, Saint Severus, who was one of the champions of faith at this time, and one Saint Jacob Baradeus, and Saint Philoxenus as well. So all these people were part of the non-Chalcedonian church that tried to explain the faith and to write more about the faith and the dogma and why they rejected the Council of Chalcedon. This era continued till the year 640 or 640, when the Arabs invaded the Middle East. So before that, there used to be some dialogues between Christians in the West and Christians in the East, and every party used to explain in writings and in discussions why they reject the Council of Chalcedon, or why they accepted and there was some sort of dialogue. And many of the emperors tried to mitigate between both parties and tried to reach a common ground between the two parts of the church. But when the Arab came to the Middle East, then this connection ceased to exist. So the East was completely isolated from the rest of Christianity, and there couldn't be any sort of connection between this. And of course, you know, this followed by many difficulties that the East faced, and some persecutions and some hardships along the way, and also followed by the era that we call the Middle Ages. The Middle Ages in the church, in the East, was sort of like the Middle Ages in the West as well. It was the era of weakness and a bit of darkness. But in this darkness also we see many of the saints that we know and read about, like Saint Abraham ibn Zara and Saint Simon al-Khara Simon, and then Saint Ruwais and Avatiji as well, Amba Barsum al-Arian, and so on. So these people they were mostly commoners, so that they were not priests, they were not bishops, they were not theologians like we read about Saint Athanasius or Saint Cyril. They were simple people who were very holy and very faithful, and they decided to shine in this darkness of the Middle Ages when people were not very, didn't have the chance of education or reading or stuff like that we read about in the previous era. The writings of this era also is very important, because that's the era when all the Coptic writings that we have, the dictionaries, the rules of the Coptic language were written in this era. So the Copts were afraid that their language were about to get lost, because Arabic was being forced as the general or formal language. So they decided for the first time to write the rules of their language, and to write dictionaries in Coptic, and to write grammar in Coptic. So these books that survive till this day, and that's what we teach right now. If you try to learn Coptic, these are the books that were written in the 11th century. That's where we knew about the Coptic. Before that, they didn't bother to write about it, because they talk in Coptic every day, so they didn't need to write rules or write dictionaries in Coptic. But when they felt that the language is about to get to be lost, and people are no longer fluent in the language, they decided to write it. So from this time came books about the Coptic language, and two of the most famous people who wrote these books are two brothers called Awlad al-Assal, or sons of Assal, and another one called Ibn Kibr. These are people that were very knowledgeable in Coptic, and they wrote these books. Around this time also came the Crusades. So the Crusades were maybe an additional hardship to the Middle East, or the Christianity in the East, because for the West, they considered the Christians in the East as heretics. They have never encountered Christians in the East. They didn't know who are these people, what they are doing. And of course, for the Arabs controlling the region, they felt that the Westerns coming to the Middle East will join forces with the Copts or with the Syrians, and they will rebel against them. So it was a hard time for the Christians in the East as well. At the end of the Middle Ages, after that, the next era came what we call the modern times. So the Middle Ages, we can say it continued till the 19th century for the Middle East. Of course, in Europe, during the 1600s, 1700s, started the Enlightenment, and people started to get more educated and to think about different stuff. But for the Middle East, only in the 1800s, when the church started to start a reformation. And this reformation started with Pope Cyril IV. So he was the one who started to reform the church, started to educate priests, started to teach Coptic language, started to teach hymns, teach theology, and started to build schools. Even, that the first school for girls in Egypt was built by Pope Cyril IV. So he was the one who thought that maybe girls need to be educated too, not just boys. And also he was the one credited to bring the first print, the first print, the Gutenberg print. He brought it to Egypt and he started to print books for people. So that was the first Reformation, or the start of the Reformation in the church. And he was followed by also Habib Girgis, which the one that you read about, who started the Sunday school movement and started also teaching people. And from there came a whole generation of people that started to make a Reformation in the church. Many of the liturgical, for the writings that for this era, is many of the liturgical books. So the book of Passion Week was written in this part, the Holagi was collected in this part, in this era, and they started to collect and print the manuscripts of liturgical books and started to distribute it in a large scale. So before that, only one copy of the Holagi will be in the altar, but people didn't have access to these books. But after they started printing the books and started to teach people about the church, about history and the faith and everything like that. And then the last era that we're talking about is the kingdom of heaven, which is, again, we go back to the Bible, the last book of the Bible, which is talking about not the past, but the future. So we see we started our church history following the book of Acts. But the last station in the church history is what? The kingdom of heaven, which is talked about in the book of Revelation. So you can imagine that all the era that we are living in is between Acts and Revelation. So that's when the church existed. And this part is when when St. John is talking about what will happen in the end of days, and when we go back to when Jesus Christ will come back and take us all to Him. Okay? So just to recap again, so we have, and the New Testament starts with the life of Jesus Christ. That's the peak of God's plan. Then followed by the early church. The book of Acts is talking about that, and the epistles of the apostles. That was followed by the era of persecution, which started by the apostolic father, the direct disciples of the apostles, and then other church fathers who suffered from persecution, but they started to write about faith and about the church. Then it was followed by the golden era of the church father, which we call the economical era, or the economical council era. And that's when both the theology and monasticism was the focus of the time. So we have all the saints that we learn about, like Saint Athanasius, Saint Cyril, Saint Gregory. Every one of them was in this golden era, and they were also joined by the monastic fathers like Saint Anthony, Saint Macarius, Saint Pachomius, and all of these holy men. Then it was followed by the era after the Council of Chalcedon, when the church was split, and there were some dialogues between the two parties to reconcile or to reach a common ground. And then the Middle Ages, which we said was an era of weakness and darkness, but however we have also saints and miracles in this time. And like we said, it was followed by the modern times, which we live in right now. It started with the Reformation of Pope Cyril IV and Pope Cyril V, and also Habib Girgis. And then, of course, at the end of times, the kingdom of heaven, or the book of Revelation, that's talking about the end of time. Okay, so that's all we have today.